And let me share my screen and we'll get started. All right, can everybody see that?
I'm good.
All right, fantastic. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you were able to join us today. The program this morning is STEAM 101 Sewing Basics. Our presenter today is Sydney Markham. I'll be your facilitator. I'm Christy Buchanan Wellman. Feel free to ask questions in chat or through the microphone. Either way is fine. Let's see here. So today, this is going to be a hand sewing basics program. Our project today is sewing a fall themed mug cozy. If you've ever wanted to have your beverages say warmer longer, now is your chance. And also, this will cover basic sewing skills. So if you've ever found yourself having a wardrobe malfunction or just having a button pop off or whatever, we're going to cover the basics, and then those skills learned will be applied towards doing that fall themed mug cozy. Just a quick review of Zoom features. If you're a little rusty with using Zoom, when you log in, you're all muted by default. So please be sure to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. We do encourage folks to turn on their cameras if possible, but it's not mandatory. Um, Also, feel free to ask your questions in chat. If you ask a question via chat, I'll try to find a strategic moment to ask Sydney because she's going to be focused on the presentation. And just as a disclaimer, with this program today, we are recording. That's simply in case, for somebody who may have missed the program, then they can go back and check on the library's YouTube page to cover what it was that they missed during the program if they'd like to do it or just have some extra practice time outside of class. And with that, thank you for your support of Charlotte Mecklenburg Library and Independence Regional Library. And with that, I turn it over to Sydney.
All right. Thank you, Christy.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sydney Markham. We've been doing these programs for I think like 2.5 years now, maybe three. I used to work at Independence Regional as a part-time library assistant. So that's how Christy and I got started. I've been sewing. Gosh, I took classes when I was in high school on like a sewing machine, which we, of course, have some programs where we do that as well. And then hand sewing, I remember my mom teaching me when I was a kid. So it's been definitely 15 plus years. So I'm excited to share some hand sewing basics with you all today. Again, we have a couple machine sewing classes coming up in November and December. So would love to see you all out at those. We'll actually now have 5 sewing machines available. I recently inherited 2 more. Even if you don't have a sewing machine and you're a complete beginner, that's what these classes are designed for. The idea is you get to learn a couple skills in the first hour, and then in the second hour, we work on our project, which today, of course, are mug cozies. So everyone hopefully was able to pick up their take and make kit or get some materials if you were unable to. So in your kit, you should have a little piece of 2 pieces of scrap fabric, just white cotton with a needle. And then you should have a little sewing kit with a couple different colors of thread. There's a safety pin, some buttons, and a needle in there. This needle has like the world's tiniest eye. It's hard for even me to thread, so I recommend using the needle that is attached to your scrap fabric. It'll just make it a little bit easier. And then, of course, you should have 2 pieces of fabric. You'll have a dark one. I just ran out of the darker one. So I have 2 flannels, and then you'll have a little piece of elastic stitched in. And you'll see one of them has this kind of fabric in the middle. And this is it's called Insole Bright. It's kind of like a thermal fabric that'll help retain heat and protect your hands and keep your drinks warm. So we'll be using this in our second half. For right now, if you want to go ahead and get out your scrap fabric and your little sewing kit. The first stitch we'll be going over today is called a back stitch. So when it's done well, and this is actually a student sample that they let me use. You can see here it's very neat. Let's see if I can get it to focus a little bit better. Very neat in a straight line. It looks almost like stitching we would see on clothing or bags. On the back side, you can kind of see it's a little bit thicker, and we have our knots on this side. So the name is very literal when we're stitching. I think some of y'all might be familiar with what's called a running stitch, where you kind of weave in and out of the fabric. We won't be doing that. We'll actually be going up, down, and then back. It's a little funny with the hand motion. So it was very literal. We'll be doing a back stitch. So go ahead and get your needle out. For thread, it doesn't matter what color you choose. I just recommend, since we're practicing, it'll be easier to choose a contrasting thread color. That way you can actually see your stitches. A little hard to open. And like Christy said, if you have any questions at any time, you want to turn on your camera and show me what you're working on, happy to. That's how we do our in-person classes, you know. I'm just kind of walking around the room, we're all talking, asking questions and getting feedback. So, okay. I'm going to go with the blue. For whatever reason, the black thread in these little kits seems to fray a little bit. Not a lot, but just it makes it a little bit trickier to thread that needle. Okay. And for this purpose, you'll probably want, let's say 12 to 16 inches. The little thread packets are very long. So something that you can kind of hold in between your two hands like this.
And is there a way you can point your camera down to where we can see your hands?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so if that's fine with y'all, you don't need to say
Yay!
right
Fabulous.
here. And of course, if you have a question, I can tilt it back up to my face. I know I need to learn how those YouTubers and people do it. Okay, so right now we're threading the needle. A trick that I like to use, so there are little needle threaders. I've seen people, they'll just kind of put the thread in their hand and move it back and forth with the eye. I've never been able to get it that way. What I like to do is kind of pinch the thread. I put it on my needle, pull up, and then pinch really close so that there's a tiny, tiny loop there. You won't be able to see it on that camera probably, but there's that tiny, tiny loop. A lot of times when we're struggling to thread our needle, you know, we have those frayed edges. And of course, sometimes just cutting it will help. But I like this way because there's nothing to fray because it's a closed end. And then with that tiny, tiny loop, you often can get that through the eye of your needle. Again, they do make little needle threaders. And now that I've said that, this one is really, okay, we got it. They also make embroidery needles, which are, of course, designed for embroidery floss, which is usually about 5 or 6 of these threads kind of twined together. So if you like to do more sewing at home and you find yourself struggling to thread needles, that's a great option that can make it just a little bit easier for you. So now we have both ends of our thread. For this purpose, it just makes it a little bit stronger of a stitch if we let the threads, if we let the needle kind of dangle down, and then we're going to hold our thread together at the top and tie those two ends together. So you just need probably 2 knots if you can get them kind of right next to each other. Sometimes that third knot will bring them together. And I'm just leaving a little bit at the end, maybe about a centimeter, half an inch. Once we have our knots done, our needle is threaded. So we tie that knot at the end because when we're pulling through our fabric, if we didn't have something to stop it, this thread would just pull right through and your stitches would come undone. So I'll do a couple stitches first with the back stitch, and then you all can kind of jump in again as you have questions. Just let me know. So with the back stitch, we have both of our pieces of fabric together, because when we're sewing, we're typically sewing two pieces of fabric together. And you can see in this sample, when you open them up, they're stitched together very nicely. You can see those stitches. And it kind of looks again like the outside of a regular seam. Okay, so for the back stitch, since we have a blank canvas that we're working with, you can really just, oh, thank you. Thank you, Christy. And I'm turning mine down even more because that angle is a little difficult. So you can choose any corner. I recommend starting maybe about half an inch from the edge. And we're just going to bring our needle up. Again, you can see that knot caught. It's not coming through. Awesome. And now we have that. So again, with the back stitch, very literal. I'm right-handed, not that it matters, but I will then go back towards one of my corners. It doesn't matter which. So essentially I'll either be sewing down this way or across this way. And I'm going to take my needle and go back. As you're starting out, it's okay if your stitches are a little bit bigger. This one's probably, maybe quarter of an inch. As you get more comfortable, they'll probably get even a little bit smaller. So now we have our first stitch. You can see there it looks just like what you expect it to. When we turn it around to the back, we can see our little knot. We can see our working thread and needle. And now we're going to go down a little bit past that knot. And we're going to go up. So now when we turn around to the right side of our fabric, we see our first stitch. And we see that we're kind of far away from that first stitch. So what you want to do is, again, we're going back because it's the back stitch. And you're just going to take your needle back down right next to where you did that first stitch. You can see there we have two. I'll do another one there. So again, we're coming up. As you get more comfortable, you don't always have to kind of turn your fabric over. You can just kind of hold it right side up and poke around with your needle and bring it up and then back down. So again, just like that first sample I showed y'all, we have our nice little stitches right here. You can see there's a little bit. So the right side of the fabric, that is a term for essentially the pretty side of whatever your project is. So for a project like this, the back stitch has a really distinct, essentially kind of like aesthetically appealing side, and then one that, we have our knots, we have our back stitching. Again, this is what makes it so strong. So when you say right side and wrong side, it also can refer to a fabric like this, where there's a really distinct pattern on one side, and then on the other side, not as much. So the one with the colorful pattern is our right side of our fabric. The other one is the wrong side. When you're sewing with fabric like this, where there's no pattern at all, sometimes you would mark right and wrong with some chalk, just so you know, because a lot of times when we're sewing the right sides together, we're sandwiching them, doing our stitching, and then we'll flip it right side out, just like we will for our project today. So thank you, great question. When I say right side, I just mean the prettier side, not the technical term for it, or not the technical way to explain it probably, but I think that makes sense. Great question. So if anyone is working on their stitches and would like to show or has some questions, sometimes when you get going on this one, you can get excited and forget to go back. Again, that would be called a running stitch, and it's kind of just in and out, in and out. Um, and that one is not strong, it won't hold. So that's why we want to make sure we're going back like this. And as you're practicing, I will say when you realize that your thread is getting down to maybe about twice the length of your needle. So for most people, this is probably going to be about 2 to 2.5 inches. Go ahead and pause. Because when we're sewing, we need to have two knots, one on our beginning end, one on our finishing end. Otherwise, our stitches are just going to come undone. So once you get there, go ahead and pause. I'll do a couple more practice stitches and give y'all a few minutes to practice before showing you the best ways to tie a knot at the end of your sewing. So again, if it's easier, you can be kind of flipping back and front as you're stitching, flipping it over to that wrong side, putting your needle down, flipping it back over, and pulling it up. Again, we can use our previous stitches as a guide. We'll go close, go down, and back up. And again, I have probably about 2 inches left, so I'm going to pause there. Give you all a minute or two to practice your back stitches. If anyone has any questions or would like to just turn on their camera, you don't necessarily have to show your face. You're more than welcome to just, put the camera up to your sewing project. And if anyone has questions, please let me know. Hey, Danny. We are currently working on our back stitch, which is the stitch we'll be using for our project today. One of the stitches, but the main stitch. We like it because it's pretty strong. It kind of closely mimics a machine stitch. And again, when we're done and we've done it, we can kind of pull apart. You see those two pieces of fabric aren't coming apart. You can kind of see your stitches. So the back stitch, because I know we just had some folks join us, so I'll kind of show one more stitch and explain it one more time before I show how to tie a knot. So with your back stitch, the name is very literal. You're going back as you're sewing. You would start in one of the corners about 1/2 inch away. And then once you have your needle, it's focusing. There we go. Once you have your needle up, you'll go back towards one of the edges of the fabric. Here you can see I have my needle and thread, and you can see there's another stitch right over here. So I want to bring my needle and thread past this second or past this other stitch, bring it up, and then we're going to close that gap in between the last stitch and our working thread by just bringing our needle right back down close to where that other stitch ends and pulling through. That is our back stitch. Again, you can see it's just for practice. Yours might be all over the place. You might have some stitches that are really long and it gets a little bit shorter as you get more comfortable. As you get more comfortable doing it, go ahead and challenge yourself and see if maybe you can take it from, about 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch stitches down to maybe almost 1/8 of an inch, no, not a 16th, that would be crazy. But about eighth of an inch. So again, just little stitches. The closer together they are, the stronger it's going to be. Um, okay. Does anyone have any questions or want to share what they're working on? If not, that's totally fine. Okay, as you are beginning to run out of your thread, again, hopefully you've stopped. I might have given myself enough. It's fine. I usually will show two different ways that you can easily tie a knot when you're at the end of your sewing. My favorite way when, again, you give yourself at least longer than your needle. It's easier if you give yourself maybe 2 inches, but you can probably make do as long as your working thread is longer than your needle. So mine is just by a little bit. You want to make sure that you're on the wrong side of your fabric. So again, that side where you can see the back stitching and you're not. Um, and down where you're working with your needle and thread, you're just going to take your needle and slip it under those stitches. You're not putting it through the fabric. You're just sliding it under that thread. And you're not going to slide it all the way through yet. You're just going to kind of hold it there. And if you have enough thread, which I don't think I do, um, you would go ahead and take your thread, wrap it around that needle, and pull through. And it would tie a knot. So I just had, mm, it was so close to having enough. So if you're in the same boat as me, and this method for tying a knot, again, where we slide it through, pause, take our thread, loop it around that needle and pull through, which I recommend doing at least twice. Always want 2 to 3 knots. That's okay. The other way we can tie a knot is to take a pair of scissors and just cut that thread off the needle. You want to cut it super close to the needle. So if possible, maybe sliding it in between those two threads that we're working with. See if I can get it. And cutting at the top or just getting really close to that needle. So now we have two cut threads. For this, we're going to tie it just like you would tie a shoe. I should say tie the first knot of untying a pair of shoes. So you're just going to take your two threads and tie a knot. And one more time. Again, 2 to 3 knots. They definitely make like little fabric glues and things like that to kind of stop your knots from fraying. So maybe if one time you realized you just did not give yourself enough thread, you could either maybe unpick a couple stitches, which you would have to cut that thread off the needle and just kind of go through and pull a couple up to give yourself a little bit more room. Or again, I think they make, I've never actually used them, but I've seen them where you would just put like a little dab of glue there and it would kind of hold the stitches. So now we have 2 knots on each end of our stitches. Again, our back stitch is very strong. That's part of why we used doubled up thread when we threaded our needle, because it just means that there's even more thread holding our two pieces of fabric together. We should have our 2 knots. And when we flip it over to our right side, you should see some nice little stitches where you can kind of see the distinct stitch marks. And when you pull it apart, your fabric stays put. And if you have excess thread when you've done one of your knots, you can go ahead and just trim it off.
Now, what is that backstitch best used for? What do you use it the most
This
for?
is
Mm-hmm.
great for pretty much any of our sewing projects.
Mm-hmm.
Since it closely mimics, that standard machine stitch that you see on all of the insides of your clothing, inside
Mm-hmm.
the bag. Even though we can't see it, it's on the inside of anything that's fabric covered, like furniture, pillows. So really any project that you want to accomplish with hand sewing, you're probably going to be using this back stitch. Because if, let's imagine this is the tiny little pillowcase, you would stitch along here, 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 and then you would flip it inside out. And again, it would look nice. This is what it would be our finished seam there. It would be all enclosed. So this can be used for anything. If we're talking about repairing garments or altering clothing, it'd be really great if maybe you need to take in the side seam on some pants or take it in at the waist on a dress or a shirt. Because this, you would just kind of mark where you need it to go so it fits your body better. And you would take this back stitch, kind of start at the edge of, wherever it fits good, and then bring it over a little bit more, just to take in those clothes that need a little bit of alterations. Or again, if you have a seam that, it's just kind of come undone, that happens a lot. It wouldn't work well if you had like a rip at the seam, like where the fabric was just, there's a hole. We'll go over another stitch shortly that's great for covering holes on clothing. This one is great. It mimics our standard inseams that we have on all of our clothing and most other sewn goods. Great question, Christy. All right. Does anyone else have any other questions? If not, our next stitch that we'll be practicing, it's not actually a stitch. We're just going to sew a button. So this is the one that I find most people, even if they're complete beginners, a lot of folks have sewn buttons before. You can see here, it's pretty straightforward. It's really hard to mess this one up. There's like only one way to sew a button. You and your packet should have two buttons. So one we will be using for our project. So I recommend just choosing whichever color you don't want on your mug cozy for this practice purpose. Um, I think I'm going to keep the white one for my mug cozy and practice with our black one. So if you ran out of thread on your last one, let's go ahead and rethread our needles. For this, again, you're probably going to want 10 to 12 inches, and then I would say 12 inches at least, and then we'll double them up again. So the same way we just did, where we'll pull the two ends together, tie a knot, because the buttons will be popping off. So you want to make sure that when you're repairing it or sewing them on, that it's nice and sturdy. So we'll go ahead and get our needle threaded again. Again, for today, I'm just going to keep up with the contrasting colors. I'm going to go with our blue. And for anyone who is hopping on more recently, maybe missed. So when we first threaded our needle, I talked about, sometimes you're able to, just get it the way you normally would with one of the ends going through the eye of that needle. They make little needle threaders where it would be a little piece of metal going through, and then you would put your thread through it and pull through. Um, I like to, I might actually be able to get that one, but I like to, a lot of times the reason it won't go through is because those raw edges are getting a little bit frayed. You can always trim them. You can, of course, wet the end. We've seen everyone do that. I don't like to do that because it can cause the eye of your needle to rust, which if you're not sewing frequently, you might not care about very much. But I go through a lot of needles teaching these classes. So I try not to do that. What you can do is take your thread and put your needle through and pull up. And then at the top, kind of just pinch. So where you have a tiny little loop. And then you pull the needle out and you're left again with that tiny, tiny loop. So this you can now put through the eye of that needle without worrying about, it fraying. Also, for anyone who's joining us, you have two needles. There's one in your little kit, and then there's also one that was attached to your two pieces of scrap fabric. You'll probably want to use that one. The one in the kit is just a little bit difficult to thread because the needle eye is pretty tiny. So again, for the button, we're just going to um, pull both of our ends of our thread even. We'll have our needle dangling down, and then we'll tie 2 to 3 knots at the raw edges of the needle. So you want, or sorry, of the thread, you want your needle down here and your knot up here. And no fancy or anything for this. We're just tying 2 little knots. If you find that your 2 knots are kind of far away from each other, like this, you probably can't even see because they're so tiny, but they're not touching. If you do a 3rd knot kind of in between them, it usually brings them together really nicely. Like that. And it's important, you always want that, unless you're not planning on your stitches lasting very long, and you plan on like taking it out because it's a basting stitch, which is what we call kind of temporary stitches to hold things in place. You're pretty much always going to want to make sure you have that nicely knotted. Otherwise, your hard work will shortly come undone. So we have our needle threaded. Again, when it's doubled up, I have about 6 inches to work with, which is plenty for sewing a button. So we have our back stitch practice along one edge. For our button, we're actually going to open up our 2 pieces of fabric, and you can choose whichever side you like. And then we're just going to kind of fold over one of those edges just a little bit, maybe 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. This is because typically when we're sewing buttons, they're on kind of a thicker part of our clothing or whatever project we're working on. A lot of times they're on in the front of your shirt or your pants. Um, and there's usually what we call interfacing, which is just kind of like a special fabric that we put in between, and it makes it much firmer and stiffer. So a lot of times, again, these will be getting sewn on a really firm, kind of thick piece of fabric, especially if you're sewing on like denim, you probably will need, a nice embroidery needle. For today, just go ahead and fold that over. This fabric's really lightweight, so you can kind of just fold it like you would a piece of paper and it'll hold pretty well. Or if you want to use that second needle from your little kit as I'm just going to use a regular pin. You can use that second needle in your kit as a little pin. You could just put it somewhere and kind of holds it in place. So we'll just be sewing our button through those 2 layers of fabric. Doesn't matter where, but of course you'll see with our project later, we will kind of want to make sure it's in the right spot and maybe use, a pen or a pencil to mark it. But for this purpose, just make sure it's on those 2 pieces of fabric. So you'll go ahead and kind of place your button down and make sure it's in the right place. and then you'll take your button off. If we wanted to make sure it was in the special spot, we would have maybe done two little marks, put it there, and maybe I would have marked on either side of it. Or if it's maybe a little hard. Some buttons have bigger buttonholes, and you could probably mark in between the buttonholes themselves, and that'll just kind of let us know where we're doing our stitches. And then this is, in my opinion, the easiest way so that you're not poking blindly the first time you do this. See if I can get it to focus. You're just going to go ahead and bring your needle up and all the way through. We have our knot, we have our needle and thread. We're going to take our button and we're just going to drop it down. That way, again, you're not poking, trying to figure out where the buttonhole is. We now have it on there, and you can use that knot as a guide. So when we're sewing our buttons, typically we'll kind of sew, especially if there's 4 buttonholes, we'll do diagonal. You absolutely could also do kind of like perpendicular and make an equal sign instead of a plus sign. I like to sew diagonal. I just like the way it looks better. But either way, as long as you do it a couple times, it'll keep your button. It'll keep it nice and sturdy. So you'll just make sure you're going down the diagonal buttonhole from where we did our first stitch. You're going down through, pulling through, making sure that it's good, that it didn't get stuck. And I recommend after you kind of pull it tight to give your button a little wiggle. When I actually learned to sew in high school, our sewing teacher had us put toothpicks underneath. Because again, typically when you're sewing, there needs to be a little bit of fabric that goes underneath the button. And if you were to sew it on too tight, it would probably strain that thread and just pop it off again. So give it a little bit wiggle. And then go ahead and flip it back over to that wrong side of the fabric and use that knot as a guide to where to put your needle. It doesn't always work perfectly, but usually once you get it up, you can kind of turn it back around and wiggle that button, but it should come up right in that hole so that, again, you're not having to poke yourself accidentally. And then you're just doing that diagonal again. I recommend 3 times, no more than 4, because it would just there would be too much bulky thread there. You can kind of see blue on black is probably not the most easy to see color choice on camera, but I've done it twice now. Again, I'm turning it over, lining my needle up with that knot. And when I turn it back, I have to kind of adjust the button. And that's another nice thing, by giving it a little bit of that wiggle. When we turn it over, we are able to kind of move the button and the needle around. 3 times. And 3 times. Once you've done that 3 times, when you're on the back side of your fabric again, you can kind of use those knots as guesswork. So you'll probably just want to go in the middle of them and go over to one side a little bit. And it should bring you up through one of the other eyes of the buttonhole. One of the other buttonholes. Okay, and we're crossing. I'm just making that little X. Should be 3 times. And once you've done your little X, you'll flip it over. Your thread your thread will be, your working thread will be on the back. And so I have plenty of thread left over this time to show you all how to tie a knot the easiest way, in my opinion. So we'll have our needle. We're going to take it under our stitches. Again, we're not going through that fabric. We're just slipping it under. There's a lot of stitches in one place. It'll probably hold it if you were to take your hands off of that needle. You're putting that needle about halfway through. You're grabbing that working thread that's still attached to our needle. And we have a loop, and we're just going to slide that loop over the edge of our needle. Again, sliding it under our stitches. Grabbing that thread, looping it over tip of that needle. A little hard to do with this angle. And we're pulling our needle through. So all that's doing is tying a knot at the base, which is exactly where we want it. So do that 2 or 3 times, and then you're good to cut your thread. Try always when you're trimming your thread, you don't want it so close to the knot that it comes undone. The amount that I have here, just maybe, you know, 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch. That's how much you want to leave there. Still have the tiniest little bit left. So those are, hopefully you all have successfully sewn a button. We'll be sewing one on our finished project today. If anyone has any questions, now is the time.
Does anyone want to share their button success? Anybody want to share? I know Erica kind of got cold feet. I try to encourage her to stay. I mean, like I mentioned in the
Oh,
chat, this program is being recorded, so you have plenty of time to practice. There's not a test on this. These are just skills that will help you. We know it's not going to be something that might be easy to pick up right away, but the more you practice it, the more it's going to become easier for you. So that's why we're recording this, so you can practice afterwards.
I'll
yep,
show my button if
exactly.
you want to see it.
Oh, that would be great.
Let's see if I
Okay,
can.
let me turn it to where we can
Yay,
get
it
a
looks
better.
good.
Uh,
Yeah.
Perfect.
there you go.
Woo.
Yeah, the
That's
button,
awesome.
to me, I'm like, the button is that's an easy win. Most of the time, again, a lot of times people already know how to sew a button, so this might just be
Right.
a refresher. But honestly, it's one of the most important things. Like buttons pop off all the time.
Yeah. Exactly.
All
I'm trying
right.
different views. I'm trying to get it to do a close up, but yeah. That is awesome. Thanks for sharing, Erin.
Thank you. All right. And again, if anyone wants to share, no pressure, but it's fun. Um, so our next stitch, let's see, I've got a couple samples here, see if any of them look nice. Our next stitch is the satin stitch. It's really a stitch you'll see often in embroidery, like decorative embroidery. Um, Here, it's a pretty good one. You can see, let's see if I can get it to focus better. I'm not used to this web camera at all. Yay. Yes, I swear, threading a needle can sometimes be like the hardest part of getting going. If this class were in person, I do have some needle threaders, and I'll just buy a couple in bulk and put them in the take and make kits for any future online classes as well. It just makes it a little bit easier because I know, like, if you can't get it threaded, it's like, well, I can't even enjoy this. So congratulations, Katie. Yes, threading the needle is quite an accomplishment. Um, with our next stitch, the satin stitch, again, you can kind of see a decorative. And I'm actually going to show you all what it looks like since I'm in my sewing room. You can see here, I have a pegboard. Highly, highly recommend. You can get these at any hardware store. They do little like hooks for everything. So I have my mini scissors. So if you come to our in-person classes, you'll get to use these. I've accumulated like 8 pairs since we do these classes every month. I have some embroidery hoops, which again, if you do embroidery or even for this next stitch, if you had a little one, something like this, and let's say, because the satin stitch is really great at repairing holes in your clothing. So, ripped knee, even a ripped like side seam, or maybe that pocket. My fiance, we've been together 5 years, and when we first started dating, his favorite pair of jeans, the pocket on the back was coming away from the fabric. So I just used this satin stitch, and I did use embroidery floss and an embroidery needle because it's denim. Just take one of these, you would put your fabric in between there will be like 2 circles, and you'll put them in between. Your hole would be in the middle, whatever that rip or tear or whatever you want to do your embroidery on would be here, and you would tighten it up, and then it holds your fabric nice and taut, and you can just do your stitches. I think that's probably the hardest part of the satin stitch is getting not only your sewing thread tension accurate, but also holding that piece of fabric. So if for any reason you have small embroidery hoops in your home and you want to go grab one, now is the time. I think honestly, this is too big even for my little piece of fabric. But so it'll be used to kind of sew 2 little pieces. You can't see it under here, but we did cut a little hole. And if you want to now, and you have a pair of scissors near you, I dropped mine. You'll go ahead and on the other side, actually, you can do it on the side where we have our buttonhole. Just find a little bit of fabric, kind of pinch it, and take a pair of scissors. If you don't have scissors or for whatever reason you can't get it cut, totally fine. We can just pretend there's a little hole there when we're practicing our stitch. And you'll just snip maybe half an inch, nothing crazy. If you have scissors, especially if they're not fabric scissors, usually if you open them and use kind of the part at was this a fulcrum? The part closest to the fulcrum, it's usually the sharpest and the strongest. So like even with my fabric shears, I was having a hard time snipping just at the tip. So if you kind of open it wider, it'll make it a little bit easier. So we're just making a small hole. You can kind of distress it a little bit as if it were a real hole on a pair of pants. And our satin stitch is essentially going to go back and forth over this hole to make a new piece of fabric. Looks like this. And I wish I'd grabbed his jeans before we started to show you all, because I always say that in our in-person classes. One of these days I'll remember to take a picture or something. So a satin stitch there. Once we get started, I'll go find, I have an embroidery piece that I started like 7 years ago. Have not finished. It's like 90% of the way done, but satin stitch is frequently used because it's a really great way. You could make this decorative. Some of those books that are on that list kind of tell you how to repair your clothing in a fun, creative way. So you could do a little heart-shaped patch. It could be a little leaf, whatever shape you really wanted. It'll kind of cover that hole that we've made. For our satin stitch, I recommend choosing, it doesn't matter for this purpose what color you choose, but you're probably going to want most of that thread that's on there. Right now we've kind of been, a foot and a half. This one you're probably gonna want closer to maybe 20 inches, which for me, is like a little bit like if I hold it at one hand and down to the elbow, it's not exact, but it's close to 20 inches. If you're shorter, you might want to go a little bit less. If you're someone on the taller side, like our friend Trevor, you might want to use mom's arm as the measurement. Or if you have a ruler around, you're more than welcome to. So for the satin stitch, again, we'll be threading our needle and pulling both ends together and tying them together. If you were using embroidery floss, again, it's much thicker than just our regular thread. It's, I think, 5 or 6 of these strands kind of twined together. So we'll just be working with 2. Actually, I have embroidery floss right here. This is embroidery floss. You can get them in all colors at any craft store, but also like Walmart has a pretty nice crafting selection. And depending on which Walmart, they usually have fabric too. So that's a great option because I know Charlotte's fabric shops, I think there's Joann's, and it's kind of chaotic every time you go in there. So just saying there's lots of options. Sewing can be pretty accessible, but embroidery floss can be used for decorative purposes. And you can see here, that's one strand. It's much thicker. So go ahead and get your needle threaded. And if you were doing this on your clothing, you could go and get embroidery floss that closely matches the color of whatever project or clothing item you're working with. And it would be a pretty subtle repair. Again, you could also choose a contrasting color for a little fun. Here's kind of another little sample of what it looks like. This one you can see there's that hole, and we've started to cover it with our satin stitch. And it's called that because when, again, it's tricky, it might not look that nice on your first try. Mine never look very nice because I'm talking and I get distracted as I'm doing my stitches, but it'll look like satin because that thread or that floss is just really smooth and a little bit shiny. And threading our needle. And again, if you were, again, like if you have a pair of pants that you want to fix a hole on and patch, I recommend going and buying a matching embroidery floss, and then also making sure to buy embroidery needles, which have much larger eyes than what we're working with today because they're made to fit several pieces of thread at a time. And they're also usually a little bit longer and thicker so that they can go through heavier weights of fabric. And especially since you'd probably be working with them a lot more, it just makes it a little bit easier to hold. And they're pretty cheap, and you can get them at any craft store and definitely Walmart, maybe Target. I don't know. I don't think Target really has much of a sewing selection. Okay. So we're again tying our 2 ends together. We'll have our needle down here, our knots at the top. Okay. If you were able to, cut that little hole in your fabric, we're going to go ahead and sew over it. If not, totally fine. You can still practice these stitches and know that if you needed to use them to cover a hole, you absolutely could. So I recommend when you're doing this stitch, again, especially if it was a larger project, you might want to go ahead and get an embroidery hoop. It would make your life a lot easier because it would, be holding the tension. And when we do this class, sometimes I will come around and help y'all and I'll hold the fabric like this because you can see when it's kind of taut like this, that that hole there, um, like the edges are even because that's what we want. We just kind of want to cover that up with our thread. We don't want, it'll happen as you're practicing. You'll see it pucker a little bit because maybe you pull too tight on one side. But if possible, kind of hold it with your non-dominant hand and pinch like this. So I'm pinching with my pointer finger and middle finger, and then my thumb and ring finger. And it kind of mimics what a embroidery hoop would do. It's just a little bit more one-sided. So we have our hole there. We have our needle and thread. And when we start our stitching, so for this one, it doesn't matter which side you start on. Just make sure you're gonna want your stitches to kind of run. They're gonna go about a quarter of an inch on either side. Because if we were to put our stitches too close to that raw edge, it would just end up fraying and it wouldn't hold very long. So you want to give yourself plenty of room. You want to make sure that over time, as this hole probably still continues to stretch a little bit, that it's not getting to the point where our stitches don't have any fabric to hold on to. And just because it makes it a little bit easier, especially for your first few practice stitches, I recommend also starting about a quarter an inch away from the like the vertical start of the tear. So I'm gonna start my stitches. Again, you can see a little blurry, but you can see right there. That's the tear. I'm starting my stitching over here. And this one, again, I think the hardest part is the tension. Because other than that, it's a pretty straightforward stitch. We're just going to be going back and forth, back and forth. So like a little crisscross, but really tight together. So for that first stitch, we'll come up. Again, kind of check your tension, because if I pull it too tight, you can see that fabric starts to pucker. So I want to pull those pieces apart until it kind of lays flat. And then we're going to take that needle and we're just going to go back down across close to where that first stitch was. There we go. And then we're going to take our needle up. So this one, I think this is a stitch that's a little bit easier to practice without flipping your fabric over. You absolutely can still do that. I could flip it, make sure my next stitch lines up with that one and go up. But I think as you're kind of holding that tension, you'll see that it's pretty easy to find where your next stitch will line up. So again, you're just going across, down, then you're bringing your needle back up close to where that other stitch was. The pink might be a little hard to see, sorry y'all. But as you're going, it'll start to look like its own kind of piece of fabric. So you'll start to see a nice shiny pink. And as I get closer, so I haven't even started to cover that hole yet. And I'm already getting a little off a track. So if you ever realize, oops, that stitch was a little too short, it's okay. The next one, just kind of adjust. It doesn't have to be like perfectly straight on both sides of your stitching. If it is, that's really impressive. And again, if I pulled too tight there, you can see my fabric bunches up. If you accidentally do that, you just kind of grab them, pull it apart a little bit. Of course, I think I pulled too tight, so now it's gonna stick a little bit. That's okay. And actually you can see as we're getting closer that hole is kind of starting to overlap just a tiny bit because we're starting to pull those sides of the fabric together, which is why we want to, again, give ourselves a little bit of room because this thread is going to be pulling and it's going to be stressed when we, if it were at like a knee, because a lot of times on our clothes, we get holes at points where we get the most friction and the wear and tear. So it's usually going to be, those joints or kind of like inseams. And this is a great way to fix any of those holes. And mine are not super close together, which if you were doing this with embroidery floss, since the embroidery floss is so thick, your stitches wouldn't need to be, they would still be right next to each other, but there would be a tiny little bit of space in between them. And y'all can kind of see that that hole is starting to come together. See if I can get it to focus. There we go. So you see that little bit of pink thread. It's puckering a little bit. That's partially because I pulled it too tight at the beginning when I was trying to show y'all what happens when you pull it too tight. But also we can see that hole is starting to kind of close in on itself. So we're just going back and forth. Again, over, cross, right next to each other. Stitch fix a hole in the couch. Ooh, yes, embroidery floss would definitely work. A hole in the couch, I will say it depends on where the hole is. I think if it's somewhere like, a lot of couch cushions, you can, take off the covers or even, they'll kind of have that zip at the top. If it's something where you can get to the front and the back side, it would work really well. And you might even want to go get a scrap piece of fabric of like a heavyweight, or at least I'm assuming heavyweight. Most couches are like that upholstery fabric that's pretty heavy duty. You might want to get a piece of that, kind of put it underneath. So let's say this is your couch. This is your, the pretty side of your couch fabric. You have a tear right here. You might want to go and get a patch. Also a great way to patch, holes in your jeans, in your jacket, whatever. I fixed a lot of jeans this way. You'll put a patch facing up. I have a patch sitting right next to me. So you would have your patch, you have your fabric, and you would put your patch right side. So again, that nicer side of the fabric facing up. And you could do your oh, thank you. You would do your satin stitch there. Again, if you for something like this, if you can take it off, or even if you can just get in between, even if you're sitting on the couch, kind of pushing that cushion down and grabbing those two layers of fabric, you should be able to use this. And if you have a little embroidery hoop, it should look actually really nice when you're done. You can also, trying to think, because I haven't done it on a couch, but I've seen people take like patches. And this one, so I use a tool called pinking shears. You can see there's this zigzag edge. They're scissors and I have a pair and I bring them to class. And they're not very expensive. So if you foresee yourself doing a lot of patching, it might be a good investment. But it prevents the edges from fraying. So I could sew this on top of something, do a little stitch around the edges, and I wouldn't have to worry about this fraying a lot. So that might be another option if you can't really get that piece of couch fabric, like it'd be a little hard if it's really attached to that cushion. But what you might be able to do is get a nice patch and put it on top. Maybe even use some of those like seam glues, put a little bit of that down. Maybe do this satin stitch just around the edges of your patch, or a little running stitch. Yeah, I'd be curious, Maureen. Next time you're in person, feel free to bring pictures. I'm definitely not. I mostly sew clothing, but I'm all for trying to extend the life of anything if possible. Great question. So hopefully you all are working on your satin stitches. Let's see if I can get this to focus. I like a YouTuber. Let's see if I get out of the way. There we
It
go.
seems to focus about the same area where your face is, about that distance. Sometimes I think that seems to be where the clearest focus is. So I don't know if you need to pull the PC closer to you
Okay.
or
Further,
so it can focus a little better. I'm not sure.
I
Maybe that
know
would
I
help.
and we
It's
haven't done one
it's
of these in
fussy.
so long.
I know, right?
I know, I remember, I forgot, I was like, oh, I always wear solid colored shirts when we do these, but I wasn't
Oh,
thinking,
it's been a while. It's been a year since we've done an online program.
yeah, just make these notes to myself for the next time we do one. Wear solid colored shirt. Yeah, you're right. Like when I hold it here, it focuses. I just want to get so close to the camera.
Right.
Um, but so you can see, I have my satin stitch. I still have my needle attached. I haven't done my knot yet. That hole.
Or maybe
I
you could hold it in front of a felt board, like a dark felt board, and that way
Oh,
you
that's
wouldn't
a
it wouldn't
great
matter what
idea.
what shirt you wore.
Yes. Okay. You know what? Let's try this. I'm sitting, we have a drum pad next to us.
Ooh,
That might work a little bit. Yeah, great
yeah.
idea, Christy. I love that. Okay. Dark background, something a little bit lighter weight. The drum pad's a tiny bit heavy, but um, yeah. So you can see we have our stitches that are kind of pulling both edges of that fabric, that ripped fabric together. There's a little bit of a pucker. You can kind of see it down at the bottom and at the top. Not super noticeable, especially if this were a heavier weight fabric. Heavyweight fabrics aren't going to bend like this. And again, I think a lot of times our holes like this tend to show up on our pants and our jackets that get a lot of wear and tear. And you can see, it's kind of shiny, kind of smooth. Hopefully you're able to kind of run your fingers over it, see why it's called the satin stitch. Again, it's okay if it looks, let's say I have a lot of samples here. So this one, you can see clearly I was started a little bit bigger on one side and was getting a little bit closer together. It's okay if it's not perfect, perpendicular, um, parallel lines. The whole point is we're just trying to kind of put a new layer of fabric using our thread over that hole. Okay. All right. And hopefully everyone is doing okay with that satin stitch. Again, I'll show y'all one more time how to do those, how to tie it off. Again, make sure you're on your side that has your first knot. And then we're just going to slide under maybe 2 of those most recent stitches. And if you can, loop that thread around that needle. I made it too short again, so I'm going to have to cut it. And after this, it will be time to get into our project for the day. Okay. Again, if you were to cut it a little bit too tight, or sorry, if your thread was too short as you were sewing, you got a little too excited, forgot to stop, you can just cut it off and sew those. And not so. Tie those together. Here we go. At least 2 of them. Trim them with your scissors. Okay. And there you have it. We have our satin stitch. Hopefully y'all's looks a little bit similar to this. A little bit of puckering, no problem. And that's a good one to practice. Again, if you were getting ready to do it on a piece of clothing, maybe just cutting a piece of scrap fabric and doing a little bit of practice might make you feel more confident before, repairing something. Um, but again, if you get that matching thread, nobody will even notice if it's a little wonky. Highly recommend doing that. So if nobody has any questions, we are ready to get into our project. So the 2 stitches we'll really be using are that back stitch, and then we'll get to sew a button on. So in your kits, you will have your 2 pieces of fabric. I have 2 plaid just because I didn't cut enough of the red ones, but you should have a plaid one and a nice burgundy that matches. As I mentioned earlier, we have a right side and a wrong side to our fabric, especially when it's patterned fabric like this. So this is very clearly the right side where our design is very visible. This is the wrong side where it's not. Most of the time when we're sewing, it's right sides together. If you're following a pattern or project instructions, it'll typically tell you right sides together, wrong sides together. Because when we sew our right sides together, it doesn't look cute, but then when we flip it out, it looks cute. So pretty straightforward. We have our 2 rectangles. This one I stitch on there for y'all just because some things are easier with a sewing machine. This is Insul Bright. It'll keep your mug insulated and keep your hands from burning, but it'll also keep your drink warm. If you come out to our next program, we'll be using more of this to make little pot holders. And I think we made those earlier this year as well. So I have a lot of it, so I'm trying to use it up. All right. You'll want to line those 2 up. You'll also have one edge that has this elastic sewn in. Again, just kind of helping y'all out because some things are a little bit harder. You could absolutely do this without a sewing machine. You might want to get a little bit of like fabric glue and hold this elastic down before you do your stitching because it tends to wiggle around a lot. Even on a sewing machine, it was kind of moving. And then, because when we flip them out, our elastic will be on the outside here, ready to wrap around our mug. So you just want them sandwiched together. You will be able to use this outline of our Insul Bright as your stitch guide. So when you're sewing, make sure the side is facing up, and you're just gonna sew maybe 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of that Insul Bright. As long as you're not getting too close to that raw edge of the fabric. If you get too close, it's really easy for holes to tear. So as long as you're somewhere kind of close to here, but no more past that middle, your stitches will be fine. When you turn it inside out, it'll still look good and it'll still be usable. And then if you have maybe a pencil or a pen nearby, so again, we're gonna have to flip this right side out. So you're gonna need to leave about 3 to 4 inches open on one side. I highly recommend that you do this on one of the long sides of your fabric. It makes it a lot easier when we're going to close those stitches. If it's in the corners, you'll have kind of raw fabric bunching out. So again, I just have a pen. Doesn't need to be fabric markers or anything like that because it'll be on the inside. We won't see it. And just go ahead and mark. And the nice part with this fabric is that it kind of already has those lines for you. So if you don't have a marker, that's totally fine. Just kind of keep in mind, okay, when I get to these 2 red lines, I need to stop. I also have a yellow Sharpie. Let's see if this works. Yep. Again, just maybe 3 or 4 inches. No more than four, because again, the further you get to those edges, the more likely it is that you'll have a trouble closing that seam when it's time to flip it right side out. If you have any pins nearby, absolutely feel free to use them. For this project, not completely necessary, but I think it would be helpful, especially since most of you all are beginners. Even if you just use that one needle from your little sewing kit and just kind of put it in the middle. If you have more, I recommend maybe three, one on kind of each end, and that should be plenty to kind of hold everything in place. But again, if you just want to use that one needle from your sewing kit, it just kind of helps keep the fabric together. We won't be moving around too much, and it's really easy to see where you're stitching. So for this, we'll be using the back stitch, which again is our strongest stitch. So when we flip it right side out, it'll look good. And you'll want to go ahead and it doesn't matter since this thread will not be visible from the outside. You might want to save that white thread if you haven't already used it for when we're closing up our seams, because we'll have that opening and we'll have to do just a little stitch along the edges to get it to close up. But not a problem if you've already used it. I would just maybe save one of those threads that you like the best, because that will be the only one that's visible. So we'll just go ahead and get our needle threaded again. Since we'll be doing quite a bit of sewing, you're probably going to have to thread your needle a couple times. So it doesn't matter what color you start with. We're going to go ahead and get our needle threaded. I'm going to start with a longer one. And again, since we're going to be using most of this thread, you're probably just going to want to go ahead and take all of the color off at the time that you're threading your needle. Okay, here we go. And I think I dropped my needle. Yes, I did. Right. Here's another one. So right now you should be threading your needle. Go ahead and getting your opening on your project marked. And maybe getting it pinned. And making sure that our right sides are together, so the more colorful ones. For that burgundy fabric, it doesn't matter. There's not a distinct right or wrong side. But for the plaid flannel, it definitely matters. Okay. Again, pulling both even. If for any reason you feel like you're running out of thread, or you just want to extend how much thread you're working with at a time, you can thread the needle. So we've been pulling both ends together, tying them, doubling up our thread essentially. You could also pull one end longer than the other. So we'll have, this gray is a little bit hard to see, but you can see here, I have one end of my thread here and the other one keeps going. I would tie my knots on the longer one, and you might need to tie 3 or 4 knots just because it's thinner. And then we essentially have double the amount of thread. So again, if maybe you've gone through most of your thread and you know you don't have any more in the house, or you're just a little as you continue your project and you realize you might be close to running out of a color, you can use this option. Again, you just pull one longer than the other, tie the knots at the end of that long one, and then as you're sewing, you'll just kind of adjust them as you start to do more stitches. You'll pull the long one again. The only thing you just want to be careful, if you pull too far, that short one will unthread your needle, but all you have to do is rethread it. So just wanted to give that option for y'all. I'm not sure what folks' thread usage has looked like. And when we're in person, of course, it's not a big deal because I have so many extra supplies. But with those take and make kits, I don't want anyone to not be able to finish because they ran out of thread. So I'm actually going to take that approach. This time I'm just going to use one strand. I pulled one longer and I'm just tying a knot at the end of that long thread. And this time I'm tying at least 3 knots, 4 if you can't get them all kind of in the same place. And for my folks who maybe joined later, or even just for everyone who, wants to see that back stitch again, I'll go ahead and do a couple. Jump in if you're confident and you've done this before, work away. This time is for you all to work on your projects, answer questions. If anyone, again, wants to come off mute or video, anything, that's what I'm here for. So again, with our back stitch, we are starting away. So you'll kind of want to go backwards. Let me think about this. I will be going this way. I want to start on the other side of my opening here that I have marked. Let me think about this. No, other way. Hold on. Yeah, I think this is the hardest part when you're starting the back stitch, is trying to figure out which side you're supposed to start on. With the machine, it's easy because you're going forward. With the back stitch, of course, we're going backwards. Let me pause for a moment. Yep, okay. So I have my kind of opening facing away from me. I'm going to be starting to the right of that opening, and I will be taking my needle for my first stitch up here. Going through, and then going back towards that mark. And again, I'm using my Insole Bright as a guide. That makes it a little bit easier for y'all. And we're going up further down. Make sure. And back down. So you can see here, if I just have it pinned in the middle right now, this fabric is kind of falling. You might be sewing on a table, that might be a little bit easier. Or if you have just that one pin and maybe you want to kind of put it on the edge that you're working on and then move it as you sew along, that's also an option to make it a little bit easier. But I think if you kind of put it on a table and are just kind of holding it and flipping it back and forth, it should be pretty stable and you won't have to worry about it wiggling around on you too much. Okay. And this is what you'll be doing for the next about 30 minutes or so. Hopefully you'll be able to finish your project before the end, but as Christy said, that is absolutely why we record these. It might take a little bit before it's up on the library's website, of course. I think Christy put in an estimate. But if for any reason you're unable to finish, or even if you need to leave us early, though that video will be available to guide you. For this part, we're truly just doing the back stitch over and over. We are going around the edge of our Insel Bright as our guide. And I'll make sure, of course, to kind of show you all. That's why I'm kind of sewing quickly, because I want to make sure I get the opportunity to show you how to sew that button, how to flip it right side out, and how to close that opening that we left. And if anyone does have machines at home, um, obviously this is a hand sewing class, but if you wanted to go out and make a bunch of these yourselves, it would be even faster on a sewing machine, and you would do it the exact same way. You would just be sewing around the edge of using that as your stitching guide. Also, if you wanted to make more of these at home, um, uh, the reason I did that kind of stitching in advance is it would just take you all a long time to do it yourselves. And it's really useful because it makes sure that this stays in place when we're using it. You wouldn't want it to just, because you could just enclose it or like stuff your mug cozy, but you don't want it to wiggle around too much when you're using it. And I guess that's technically quilting, because the same way with quilts, you would put your batting in between your top quilt and the base layer. You would do the quilting to make sure it doesn't wiggle around too much. Not that I'm a quilter, but my mother-in-law is, so I foresee quilts in my future at some point soon. And I think, could be wrong, I think, Christy, there's been, I don't know if they're actively doing them, but I think there's been quilting, like small quilted project classes elsewhere in the library system before.
Yes, yes, there are some quilting groups at some other locations. I know Mint Hill Library is a very active location with
Nice.
quilting. Um, and there are some others. So if you look in the library online catalog for events, I'll see if I can post those here in the chat window so you can see where they are. Um, so that way, if you're also interested in that, then that might be something for you to pursue as well. Also, in that link for the online resources that I posted at the top, there is a great online database called Craft and Hobby, and there's also quilting resources in there too, as well as other sewing items if you would like to look, and it includes video, so it's really nice. So let me see if I can get those classes for you so you can see where they are.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Library is like just the best resource ever. People always ask me, they're like, wait, your classes are free? Of course. All right. So when I get to my next corner, I'll kind of pause and show you all just how to turn the corner. It's pretty straightforward. My first corner was a little a little bit lopsided. Not a big deal. It just means probably when I turn my fabric right side out, my corner will be a little bit rounded. That doesn't bother me at all. Again, these classes, it's for you to practice, hopefully have something at the end that you're excited to make, that you're proud of. But also do not expect any of it to be perfect. Okay, so I want to show you all this. since I am sewing with a little bit longer of a piece of thread than we've been working with so far, sometimes that thread will get kind of tangled. So like I just started to pull through and it stopped, but I could tell it caught. It's not that the thread was able to pull all the way through, it's that there was a little bit of a tangle. So every now and then, especially if you opted like I did to sew with just one thread at this time and you have the one long and short one, they get tangled a little bit more often. So you might just have to kind of turn it around, take your needle in there and kind of do a little bit of detangling. Um, that'll happen. You don't need to panic. And if for any reason it's too knotted and you can't get it, you just you would just go ahead and cut that thread and rethread your needle. Okay. And as you're sewing, you'll probably start to like, you'll kind of be in a straight line and you might kind of veer off. Just go ahead and check. Again, it doesn't matter if it's wobbly. I just want to make sure that you aren't getting too close to those raw edges. So this is perfectly fine. I have about 1/4 of an inch. If you were too close, you might have to worry about this fabric fraying and eventually coming undone, or even just those stitches getting tugged on and popping out. So just as you're sewing, pause every couple minutes, kind of check your work, maybe let that hand not cramp up. Um, yeah, that is one thing. If you are looking to get into the fiber arts, so many of them uh, require, fine motor skills, or even you're at a desk and you're kind of hunched over. So there's lots of recommended stretches for people who do crafts like this on the regular. I know I knit as well, and that really like if you're just going at it, those muscles get really tight. So thank you, Christy. Awesome. Okay, so I am coming up to my corner. Um, it's we're just going to continue our stitching and we're gonna want to sew past it. So you want your next stitch to kind of come up and you're gonna be ready to turn. So you're gonna go past that corner, line it up with where you want your next line of stitching to go and pull up there. You'll do your regular back stitch. And then for the next one, instead of again continuing to go straight, our next stitch is going to go over to the side. So now instead of, continuing off this edge, we've just pivoted. We did our stitch in that corner at a good place for a reason. So now when we bring that needle up along the longer side, we can just go right back towards that corner. And if anyone is getting close to a corner and maybe wants to turn their camera on or just wants, and see, this is why you want to check. So over here, I don't know if you can see, I am getting very close to the edge of my fabric. So I am actually going to kind of redo my back stitches here the same way if we were on a machine, you could maybe do a back stitch or even cut your thread and kind of sew over because sometimes we just miss things. So I'm going to kind of adjust my stitching and bring it over, go back over this area and just bring it in, excuse me, a little bit further. You can see here, that was where my last stitch was. Instead, I'm gonna kind of go up back to that corner and do an extra long one. And then I'm gonna go back to that same place. And this is like not fancy or super technical by any means. I'm a big fan of practical sewing. I'm not a professional seamstress or anything like that. So I'm just going to go back to near where that other stitch was and then go back about half that way to kind of reinforce. I'm a strong believer that as long as the outside looks pretty decent and it stands and you're able to use it, it's okay if the inside is a little messy. And yeah, I might need to, on this side, again, I see this would be, I probably just on this side, when I was stitching, it was a little bit uneven. So now this side is a little uneven too. If that happens to you, just kind of realize where it's at and make sure that your stitches maybe go a little bit further in. And I am getting close to running out, especially if you're sewing with just one thread instead of the doubled up. I recommend using that knot technique where you slide it under. So you're going to want to leave um, probably about 3 to 4 inches of thread before tying off your needle or tying off your thread. Here we go. So if anyone, again, was a little nervous about their thread not lasting, it looks like um, I'm about a third of the way done. So I probably will need 3 colors of thread to get this project all the way done. And see, that's what happens as you get closer to the end of your thread when you don't have those the both ends knotted together, it can kind of come unthreaded. Okay. Probably one more stitch and then I'll have to do a knot and rethread. Yep. Okay. So again, when we're doing our knots this way, we just slide that needle under our most recent stitches and go ahead. With this one, you get a little bit more wiggle room because if I don't have quite enough, I can just kind of pull it. As long as I don't unthread my needle. And then we're just wrapping that thread around, making sure the needle doesn't come unthreaded. And we're pulling through. And again, do that at least twice, maybe 3 times. Let's give it a bit. Okay. All right. Nope.
This is the quiet part where everybody's working.
I know. And if we were in the classroom, Christy would have us hooked up with the ambient music. It's about to be the little fireplace.
Oh yeah, the little fireplace things, yes.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing is it's almost like Thanksgiving, where now everybody's eating. Nobody's talking
Yeah,
anymore.
she knows the food's good because yeah. I know. And when we have the classes in person, we are a chatty bunch, but I know with the virtual, it's okay. It's a different experience. It's still wonderful. I love that it's recorded. I love that people who might not be able to make it to an in-person class are able to come. But yes, it does get a little quiet in here. Which is fine. I'm like, I just talked for an hour now.
Yeah. I also posted a link in chat about even though it doesn't look like we're doing any regular classes for quilting right now, there is a nonprofit called Craft Guild Charlotte. I put the link in there. They're a
Oh,
501c3 nonprofit, and they have regular, just group quilting sessions if you want
uh-huh.
to get together and, do some chatty talk with quilting, you know.
Awesome.
And I think they have some regular classes too. But yeah, we just are so limited with everybody wanting to use our space that it's not something we can offer on a
Yes.
regular basis right now. Maybe in the future, but right now our hands are kind of tied at the moment.
Yeah, I feel lucky that I get to because I know that the community room books up very quickly.
But we got in at a good time right after the pandemic so that it's consistent.
Exactly. Yes, and plan to keep it that way. And if anyone ever has, so we do these classes monthly. Occasionally, just because of my schedule or life happening, there might not be one. But typically every 4 weeks on a Saturday. Our next projects in November, we'll be doing machine sewing basics, and the project will be a little like pot holder, um, table warmer, whatever
Yeah,
you
like
want
a
to.
hot pad, I think that's
Hot
what you
pad. Thank
mentioned.
you.
Yeah.
Yes. Like I know everyone has a different term for it.
Let's see here. I think I have a digital. I'll post the
Oh,
flyer here.
awesome. Thank
So,
you.
yeah, I'll post that here in chat so people can see it, which makes it a little easier to reference.
Good.
Uh,
Because of that, and then December we'll be making. See, I don't even remember. I just sent them to you, Christy, but I don't.
oh, it's a reusable gift bag is the one
That's
for
right. I
December.
knew. I was like, I know
Yeah.
it's seasonal. Yes, I'm really excited about that one. So, one of my aunt's quilts, and she sent my mom years ago a bunch of these fabric gift bags. And they're awesome because, you can make them whatever size you want. Um, so they're really great for those gifts that are kind of weird sizes, or maybe you just are someone like me who does not enjoy wrapping presents. Um, but you still want your gifts to look nice. You just put it in the bag, put a little, tie it at the top, maybe put a little bow and gift tag, and you can reuse them every year. So I'll make sure to go and get some. I'm excited. I love all the holiday seasonal fabrics. They're so fun. So yes, we'll have those coming up. But if anyone ever has like, hey, I really wanted try making one of these. You're always welcome to bring your own projects into the classes, work on them there, maybe get some feedback. And also, if it's ever an idea that, could be accomplished in about 2 hours, um, nothing too crazy or advanced. I know a lot of people are interested in sewing clothing. With the format of these programs, you can absolutely learn some skills that would help you with sewing. It's just it takes a long time to sew clothes, like hours and hours. So even with like two back-to-back sessions, it might be a little challenging. But I think we do have plans to make an apron in the new year. So we'll have a couple larger sewing machine projects coming up. Um, and I sew garments. I'm just wearing a t-shirt today and sweatpants, but I have been sewing garments for 13 years now. Again, not a professional by any means, but I've made several pairs of pants, lots of dresses, lots of skirts. Pants are my current favorite. I found there's lots of awesome free patterns online where you just, or even pay what you can kind of patterns. And I think I'll even, because we can add digital resources, I might add a few of those websites that I like to the Biblio Commons list that I made. Um,
Yeah, that's what's great
okay,
about that
yes,
Bibliocommons list is you can do web links as
yep.
well as book references, and yeah, that's great.
Okay, absolutely going to do that because there's so many free or affordable patterns out there. But there's one, they're actually a magazine, but they have a website and they're based out of Australia. They're called Peppermint Magazine. And every month they release a new pattern and it's pay what you can. So it can be free or it's however much you feel you can afford. And they have this fantastic pair of pants that it's like a high-waisted, wide-legged. So I make those because I can wear them to work. I can wear them casually. Um, but yes, all that to say, you'll learn a lot of skills in the classes. Um, I would love to just, sew all day with y'all, but that community room does get booked up, so we get 2 hours. I'm like, I know, gosh, I wish Independence had a maker space.
Yeah, that would be nice. I know right now the maker spaces are located in the center part of the county.
Yes,
So North County, South County, and South Park Regional, because that's kind of this center line through the middle of the
yep,
county,
absolutely. Makes
and
sense.
that's where they are right now. But hopefully they'll branch out in the future.
Mhm. And then of course, oh gosh, when is the new main library supposed to open?
Well,
2020.
we knew it was going to be 3 years from the moment they tore it down.
Got
So
it.
it's 3 years from that point. Um, and right
Mhm.
now they're working on trying to complete University City Library. That's their main
Yes,
focus
I
right
did
now.
see
That should
that.
be coming up first, because their lease is coming up
Oh,
with their old site, so that's the reason why
yes.
they had to get the. But also they've been scouting that location for a really long time where they're moving to. It's actually right across from Boardwalk Billy's there, so they're like right next to
Yeah.
the little lake there. It's
Oh,
really a
that'll be
beautiful site.
a much nicer location than next to
Mm,
the emergency room.
oh right. Yeah, and it's 2 story. It'll really
Oh,
have a nice zen feeling. Plenty of natural light. There'll be lots more windows in there than in the old location. It's really the upgrade that area needed
yay.
because it's heavily used. It's a very
Yeah, I was
heavily used
gonna say
location.
so many students and just so
Hmm.
many people moving to that area. Yep, that's awesome. I'll be excited. There's so many libraries. I'm like, that Mountain Island one, I don't know if I'll ever make it out there.
Yeah, it's so far away. And but they're going to be adding a lot of new locations all the time. Especially, I know they've got a big wish list for adding locations on the west side.
Oh, good.
Um,
Yeah, it's really just West Boulevard.
In
And
Allegra Westbrook's, and that's really it. And it because Steel
yes,
Creek is really far down in the southwest corner of the county.
yes. Yeah, they need, yeah. Well, that's good. I'm glad. Always expanding. Love the library. Yeah, maybe someday we'll get. I've never actually been to the maker spaces, which is kind of crazy because like I stop by South Park all the time to get my whole monthly home from work. But maybe one of these days. I know they have the 3D printers, which is so cool. Okay. So again, I'm running out of my thread here. So I'm gonna go ahead and tie it. We are getting close to the end of our program. So I think I'm gonna kind of show you all. I can always come back and finish my project. So you want to have completed your stitches all the way around and have left that opening um, again right there in the middle. So I'm going to use pins for now to kind of replicate, seams to show you all what you need to do to make sure that you get to finish the project. Okay. So let's say we have, again, left that little bit of an opening. So there's plenty of space here. Uh, if you have scissors, you might go ahead and kind of clip your corners a little bit. So it'll just help reduce the amount of bulk that's in there. Um, I'm not going to clip that corner. I'll clip these two. So you want to leave maybe a quarter to an eighth of an inch fabric, but we're just cutting a little triangle at the diagonal. So when we flip our corners right side out, they'll just be a little bit straighter and less bunched up. So just trimming it. And if for any reason you flip it and feel like there's just too much, so this is our seam allowance. It's that space in between the edge of our fabric and where our actual stitches are. You can always trim it down a little bit. I recommend no less, or yes, no less than, no more, sorry, no more than a quarter of an inch. Because again, the closer you get to those stitches, the more likely they are to kind of fray. Not necessary, but just something if you wanted to do it. So you'll just kind of put your fingers inside and grab one of the short ends and push it through like this. So you can see again with those corners clipped, we're able to kind of push them out. If you have a pen or pencil or even your scissors, you can kind of push those corners out a little bit more. And again, you can see nice and clean. We can't see any raw edges. It doesn't look like it's coming apart at all, which is awesome. And I'm going to do one more pin. Just want to make sure it looks good. Because again, I know we've only got a few minutes left. Want to make sure that we get all the instructions recorded. You all feel confident and able to finish your project. If you can join us for the next one, feel free, if you would rather, maybe get feedback or finish it in person, you're absolutely welcome to bring it, even though our next one will be a, sewing machine class. Let's see if this will work with my pins all up in here. Yep, it works pretty well. I have the pins, so it's not going to be, it won't look as nice as yours do. I'm also trying not to poke myself too much with these pins. Okay. Almost there. I should have grabbed one of my old samples. That's okay. Because we did this project, honestly, maybe a year or two ago. We did them with a little bit more fabric at that time. I think we did it with flannel or the fuzzy stuff. So again, ignore mine. Yours will look much nicer. The pins just are poking and I'm not gonna. So you'll have your elastic sticking out on one side. And the other side will be, nice and sewn up. So go ahead and grab whatever mug you're using. This is just my water bottle, so it's going to be a little bit too big in this case because I measured for kind of your standard size mug. And you would go ahead and wrap that around and go ahead and take a pen or a marker, and you're probably going to, your buttonhole is, or your button is probably going to go maybe a quarter to a half an inch away from the edge of that fabric. And you can go ahead and take a marker or a pencil and just maybe do a little dot. And you're going to want it to be about in the middle. So if you want to make it really exact, you can always take a ruler and measure. You can also, again, this is, of course, a plaid, so that can kind of help you. You can kind of see it kind of have 1 inch here, 1 inch here, and 1 inch, because your finished measurement should be about, I think it's 3 inches tall by, I want to say 10 inches long. I can't remember if it's 10 or 11. So it should be about 3 by 10, 3 by 11. And you might want to mark about half an inch in right in the middle. So 1.5 inches down, half an inch over. If for some reason your mug is smaller, you would just kind of adjust. You just want to make sure that oh, this might work better. Have a candle sitting here. Yep, there we go. So it'll wrap around your mug like that. Your button will go right there. You don't want it to be a strain, but you want just a little bit of tension. So enough to where this sits comfortably, and that's where your button will go. And we know how to sew a button, so you'll be able to do that. When it comes to closing, so again, we left a couple inches open. You'll go ahead and take both raw edges and kind of just wrap them around that insole bright and use that as your guide. So once you're just kind of folding them in. So you want to make sure that there's no raw edges. There's a nice wide seam allowance for you all, so you should have plenty of room to tuck in those raw edges. If you have a pin, you can go ahead and pin kind of along here. And then when we're stitching, you're just going to go, it's called you can call this a slip stitch. It's nothing fancy. It's probably something you're actually comfortable with and maybe have used before. You would just take your needle. This one's not threaded, but just showing you all. You would just take your needle towards one of the edges, and you would go in between those two layers right at the opening. And you just want to take your needle up through, and this kind of lets you hide that knot a little bit. You can kind of tuck it in there, push it a little bit further in, and then you're just sandwiching. And with my needle, I'll just be going right along the edge. So I'm only grabbing maybe a 1/16 of an inch, just a tiny bit. We're grabbing that edge of the fabric. You want to make sure that you go through both layers and we're pulling through. So again, this one will be very slightly visible. If you have that white thread left over, wonderful. If not, it's okay. Just choose whatever color you like best. So you're going up, around, and back over. So truly just looping around the edge, going maybe about a quarter of an inch down in between each stitch. And when you're finished, it really won't be very noticeable. There might be a little bit of a pucker here, but these two edges will be sewn together. So if you ever look at, again, like anything that's kind of enclosed, maybe a couch cushion, a stuffed animal, there's probably going to be a spot. Usually it's in like the least noticeable place, and there's going to be one of these, because anytime we're stuffing something and fully enclosing it, we have to leave that little opening to flip it. And when you get to the edge, you'll just tie your knot the same way you have been doing and kind of try to stuff it back inside. You can use the eye end of your needle and kind of push it in. That'll completely enclose this. You won't have to worry about anything popping out. You'll have your button, and you'll have a mug cozy ready to wrap around. Again, this should fit your standard mug. If it's a little bit of a tall one, still kind of like the perfect hand size. Yeah, so I know we're right at 12:02, but if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Of course, if anyone has anywhere else to be, thank you so much. Thank you all. It was a wonderful class.
And thank you, Signy, for your patient and kind instruction.
Always, I love
Oh,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and thanks everyone for coming. Again, if you I'm so glad you were able to come out this morning and join us, even within the throngs of early voting. And we're glad to have you. And if you can meet with us in person next month, we'd love to have you then too. But if you can't, like I had mentioned earlier, this recording will be available in probably a couple of weeks. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.